So I did my project on Gego, whose birth name is actually Gertrude Goldschmidt, and she is known to be one of Venezuela's most famous modern visual artists. So a little bit about Gego. She was born on August 1st in 1912, and she was born into a large Jewish family in Hamburg, Germany, and she was actually one of seven children. And at age 20, she had already began practicing her passion for art and engineering. And because her family was Jewish living in Germany, once the Nazis took over in 1934 and Hitler gained power, Germany then had shifted into an economic and political focus, and her family were forced to emigrate. So Gego and her family actually moved to Venezuela, where she then kind of began her passion for architecture and engineering. So a little bit about Gego's education is at age 20, she had already begun practicing her passion for art and engineering, and she actually attended the University of Stuttgart, which is one of the oldest and highly ranked engineering universities in Germany. And then actually 6 years later, she graduated from that university and earned her degree in architecture and engineering. So really throughout her lifetime, Gego was a student of various art schools and universities, and basically from adolescence to adulthood, she always felt there was more to learn and more to grow through her art. And this is actually why Gego is known to be one of the most influential artists of all time, because no matter what age she was or where she was in life, she never stopped experimenting with unfamiliar techniques and designs and pursuing her education. After Gego had obtained her citizenship in Venezuela, she actually moved to a town called Tarma, which was a small coastal town with beautiful views. And she moved in with Gerd Leifert, who was a painter and a sculptor. And this is kind of where she was able to begin her true career as an artist, producing some of her most world famous art. And also some of her other contemporaries were Alejandro Otero, Jesus Rafael Soto, and Carlos Cruz Diaz, who had also previously experimented with geometric abstraction. So some aspects that determine Gego's work is really that her art kind of reflects more than just her ability to create illusions through lines. It actually created an allegory for her life as a young woman through the anti-Semitism and how throughout Gego's entire life she kind of remained very silent about her hardships and the struggles that she faced during her escape from Nazi Germany. So her artwork really helps share her story in both a metaphorical and a literal way by using linear and horizontal lines and motions. Um, and she also, while living with Gerd Leifert um, in Tarma, she began kind of pursuing watercolor and monotypes and different kinds of engravings to capture the details of the abstract environment. And this is where she got a lot of her influence from nature and where she was actually able to make some of her first three-dimensional pieces using just a pencil and a paper by repeating parallel lines. And she also, learned to use a variety of different materials and tracings of straight lines and squares to kind of create this three-dimensional structure within her sketches and sculptures. When Gego arrived in Venezuela in the 1940s, there was an economic boom and modernism began to sweep throughout the country. Many artists began to participate in the trend at the time. However, although Gego was aware of the movement, she didn't want to be another follower of modernism and simply just adopt the ideas that had already done before. Instead, she wanted to create a style of her own that actually dug deeper than geometric abstraction and kinetic art, and kind of incorporate some aspects of her own life into art. And, even though she kind of was influenced by the kinetic movement, she began to introduce the sensation of motion into her linear works. And this can actually be seen on the piece to the right, which is actually an untitled piece by Gego. And through this piece, she used two-dimensional and three-dimensional lines to create movement in a way other than by an outside force. So instead, through the viewer's own perception of the structure, they can see a movement, even though it's really not moving at all. And this piece is actually displayed in the Norton Simon Museum today. And her goal of this piece was just to really, create the illusion of a swaying object in space. And in order to do this, she used her techniques by using a variety of parallel lines with different spacing and densities. And then also, in addition, she used the effect of adding random scribblings all throughout the piece that move horizontally across to create a feeling of a subtle vibrating effect radiating throughout the piece. In Venezuela, Gego began experimenting with different techniques and materials, and she actually found herself to be more drawn to materials such as metal, steel, wire, and industrial scraps to experiment with different art forms and techniques than those of richer materials when she kind of started shifting her two-dimensional and three-dimensional pieces from paper to sculpture. And her work can also be characterized by her use of intricate three-dimensional lines and a complex system of overlapping that kind of expands the lines into space. And in doing so, she's actually able to create a false sense of volume and movement within her work, which can be seen in basically all of her pieces. And she's also known for her ability to create volume and movement in real life through her sculptures and her three-dimensional system of parallel lines and a complex system of knots. All of Gego's art always incorporated the idea of abstraction and focused on finding the relationship between objects in space. And although Gego never identified with a specific art movement, she was famous for her ideas on lines and motions throughout her life and now even after. Um, and she really just had this ability to create a sense of motion. And even going even further into this, she's actually widely known for her ability to understand the relationship between a line and its specific location, as well as the relationship between positive and negative space in the room. Um, and then going even further, she is most known for her ability to create a parallax. And a parallax is just really an illusion created by the movement of the viewer. And this can actually be seen in Gego's piece, The Sphere, which is to the right. And basically, this piece was just made of welded brass and steel, and she made this in 1959. But this is one of Gego's most well-known pieces, and it kind of shows how she uses bold graphic lines to replicate different parallels, and this structure really marked the beginning of her career as a successful artist, and really shows her ability to incorporate parallax into her artwork. So some major accomplishments of Gego is that at age 40 in 1952, she participated in her first art exhibition at Arte Abstracto in Venezuela. And then a couple years after that, she actually earned her own first solo art show at the Museo de Bellas Artes in Caracas, Venezuela. And I didn't put this on the slide, but actually a couple years after that, she actually was put into the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And then throughout her life, she was actually awarded a couple awards. So in 1967, she was awarded her first major award called the Salon Oficial Anual de Arte Venezolano. And then 12 years later, in 1979, she was awarded Venezuela's Premio Nacional de Artes Plásticas. And this was actually one of Venezuela's most honorary national prizes. And then towards the end of her career, in 1981, her piece Reticularia was installed at the Galleria de Arte Nacional. And this is a permanent piece to this day. So that was a very big deal for Gego. To this day, Gego is still remembered as being an icon in the visual arts and during the kinetic art movement, and her ideas on modernism are still praised in Venezuela and even all over the world today. And really her significance and why she's important is that she's famous for her ideas on lines in motion, her ability to create a sense of motion by incorporating kind of her previous education on architectural and engineering skills, her ability to understand the relationship between line and specific location, as well as her ability to understand the relationship between positive and negative space in a room, and lastly, her most important quality of being able to create parallax in two-dimensional and three-dimensional designs. So Gego died in Caracas, Venezuela in 1994. But really, kind of just summarizing her later life, during the course of her career, she was a very talented sculptor, printmaker, and painter. She was an icon in Latin America and especially Venezuela, and she really just revolutionized the ideas on line and motion, just kind of space and parallel lines and objects, and her ability to create linear knots and do the parallax effect so well. And lastly, these are my three favorite pieces by Gego. The first one we already saw earlier in my presentation, which is actually untitled, and a lot of Gego's pieces are actually untitled. The second one, Reticularia, and the third one, which we already saw earlier in the presentation again, which is called The Sphere.